Well, welcome back. And now we go back to our urban resets. And this is about a generic problem with cities, which is how do we deal with the sometimes bewildering effect they have on us? And to talk to us about that and the possible solutions to that is Tim Fenley, who is founder and creative director of Applied Information Group. And he's going to discuss how understanding our emotions might help us to understand the overwhelming condition of the modern metropolis. Tim, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. So Star Wars Cities and really comes from a, a philosopher, E.O. Wilson. I read this quote: "We have created a Star Wars civilization with Stone Age emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology." And I'm an information designer, and we work a lot with architects around the world. And this really resonated with us because what we do, where we get involved, is we're kind of like the glue between the spaces. We're kind of like we're the thing that tries to piece it all together. And these are the issues that we're often coming across and we're trying to tackle. So I just want to dig into that a little bit. But to begin with, a few illegible examples, and from my personal stories. One is been to New York. I'm sure many of you have. It was about the 10th time I was in New York that I actually found Subway. I knew it was there. I'd seen the films. I'd studied Vignelli's map, but it wasn't until I was with a colleague and they took me down these stairs that were in the street that I realised that that was the entrance to the subway. Um, and so I'd missed out on using the subway prior to that. While we worked on a project to develop a walking system for London, we observed situations like this. So this is outside King's Cross Station. If you arrive for the first time looking for King's Cross, it's to the right. No, it's straight on. Actually, no, it's to the left. Um, and so what actually is happening here is four different organisations with four different projects, and they're not really coordinating and work out what the overall message is. And then I was at a conference in DC with a good friend of mine, Jason Bruges, and we went for a day walking around the city. We both took our mobiles. Really hot day. Mine blacked out because it was too hot. His ran out of battery. What was fascinating was we suddenly felt extremely lost in a very enormous city. If you've been to DC, you understand the size of the street pattern and the buildings. And we cut our journey short and decided to go back because we'd lost that confidence and that our mobiles we were relying on. So what the main thing I want to talk about, as Jeremy was saying, was what's actually happening here in terms of our Paleolithic emotions. And we've done a lot of studying of neuroscience to kind of understand how that affects how we understand and move around places. I'm just going to take you through a few of these. Um, we often use the term people 1.0. We've moved very slowly in our evolutionary speed compared with the technology in the world that we live in now. So we're very much based, as Wilson pointed out, Stone Age emotions were very much based on how we were designed over a few millennia ago. So a few very, very quite recent um, observations and discoveries. John O'Keefe discovered place cells that live in our hippocampus, and these are cells that remember certain places. If you create a strong enough memory of a place, it will remember where you are. And if I could, right now, if you could close your eyes and take yourself back to your journey to school, I bet you could remember where to go. And if you went there now, you could guide me around on that journey to school. And play cells, incredibly long-term memory. People who play memory games, what was it, Plato and the Memory Palace use the hippocampus. Very interesting observation. We were always thinking, well, how do we create spaces that are easy to put into your hippocampus. They're very easy to digest, very legible, and therefore you're then going to learn them quickly, and then you're going to feel more in common with them. And that's where that can be applicable. Um, One technique we use to when we're working with in cities is to ask people to create mental maps, which is kind of like a secret way of uncovering what people's place selves are. And we've studied how many times certain landmarks or streets or locations or characteristics appear on mental maps, because obviously they're the ones that are creating the stronger place cells. A recent um, uh, um, discovery is grid cells, grid structure. Um, and this comes from Maybrit Moser and Edvard Moser, are very quite recent. And what they realized is place cells actually get stored in memory, but are then kind of like, I mean, it really is like a computer. They're then drawn, these maps of certain areas of the world are then drawn into this grid structure and placed on a map in these grid cells. What was really interesting when we read all about this discovery was the way in which that kind of mirrored the information structure that we'd created for Legible London's walking system of neighbourhoods, villages, and areas. And we do a lot of work with people like Professor Kate Jeffrey at UCL, who's really studied um, innate directional sense, which is not actually magnetic for humans. But what she thinks is happening is that we have a sense of direction when we walk into a building or we enter a city for the first time, and it creates a kind of like a north marker and a kind of like a ground zero. And then wherever you are in that building, you're remembering the direction, including the height, back to that entrance point. Um, and that makes sense why triangular buildings and circular buildings can be really difficult to remember, navigate, and give you a sense of uncertainty. And if you think about the Barbican and how the entrance is on the side, and that begins that difficulty with understanding how the Barbican Centre works. And architects now are still designing circular buildings, thinking about Apple Park, and they really, really challenge our ability to navigate in them. And another principle here is the Savannah principle, which is the age that we grew up and our brains were formed. We lived on the Savannah. So here, for example, if you could travel this, if this is home, you could travel 10 miles away on hunting or looking for things, and you'd see that hill on the right, and you'd be able to work out and triangulate from where that hill was as to how do you get home. And remember, survival of the fittest, it's only going to be the people who can navigate who actually survive. So that's why we develop these skills. If you put that now into the modern world that we live in, with the labyrinthine cities, pathways, the lack of vistas that we have in our environments, buildings we're not actually designed for them, and we're sometimes our brains become overloaded, they become confused, they become uncertain, and that isn't for any organization that's operating that city or any retail organization that wants people to shop in that city. It's actually not supporting them. It's one of the reasons why, theoretically, the reason why um, Oxford Street is such a popular retail street, because it's one of London's few really straight streets. And so, how this has a relevance to cities when developing our knowledge of how people get around, we did a study that looked at what we call bubbles of knowledge and how they created eureka moments. So, the image on the left is a subject. I think she was Korean, been in London for 2 years, and this was her map of London. This is where she'd been. And if you can see there close enough, it's basically little lights of knowledge around tube stations. So she would travel everywhere on the tube. The tube map was her guide, and she would pop up at these tube stations, and her friend would meet her at the tube station, or she'd find the location, the theatre or the bar. When we did this little drawing and we did these little bubbles of knowledge when talking to her about where she'd been in 2 years, she looked at this and said, "Oh, this is exactly how I see London. This is her picture. The Thames is east-west, and these bubbles are quite distributed. The image in the middle is actually the real geography of where things are. These areas were a lot closer than she thought, and she was going on the tube from Charing Cross up to Covent Garden, for example. Um, so we realized that the objective that we wanted to do was the image on the right. How can we get people to wander far enough within these bubbles of knowledge so that they reach another bubble and they have these eureka moments thinking, oh, you know when it happens, when you realize that you've just connected two parts of the city together, you now understand how much closer they are. What's actually happening in the brain, thinking about John O'Keefe, is these place cells are actually building new connections and saying that actually Charing Cross is connected to Covent Garden, not by the underground system, but by some paths on the surface. It's better to have a building, to have a campus or a development, or have a city that can create the image on the right very quickly, and everybody can realize the relationship between its parts. And another thought was knowing really what we know, which is this is a wonderful test of the blind spot. If you look at the cross and the dot on the right, probably with your screens you can do it. You've got to close one eye, disappears. I always ask the question, why isn't there there's no light coming, there's no knowledge from the eye coming there, but why isn't there a black or a white spot? I read recently it's 80% of what you think you're seeing is actually not coming from your eye. Your brain is filling it all in. So when we don't know something, we're not even aware that we don't know it. Hence the reason why I just wasn't aware how to find the subway in New York. And another challenge that we have working with the brain is this wonderful little part of the brain, the amygdala. It's the size of one of these, and it sits next to the hippocampus. And this is where our habits live. This is what means that you keep going on the same journey every time, and you won't try something new. This is where you will keep smoking, even though your logic part of your brain says you should stop. How do you try and reprogram that amygdala? We've just had an event, that COVID, that's had a wonderful chance, um, forced us to think about how we rethink how we travel. Hence, loads more people are trying cycling. And another wonderful book and a theory that we think about a lot is Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. This is that the brain has two real thinking methods. One is thinking fast. In other words, you're not really thinking. That's when you go up to a door handle and it's got a handle sticking out, and you grab a hold and you pull, and it doesn't work, and you're suddenly thinking, oh, is it locked? Have I got the wrong door? And then you realize you need to push, and you've had to switch to your calculation memory. The brain doesn't like to think slow. It wants everything fast, especially when it's getting around. How do we develop and design places that allow us to think fast in the right place? I'm going to skip this one for time, and that one too. And the only way this happens, in our experience, is that you need to engage people. And the only way to do that is to get them to really, really concentrate. And the only way that happens is when they have a very specific need or real interest. So when we designed London's walking system, we made sure that it delivered on their immediate needs. This is the way to a certain direction. This is the way to the tube station. Or if you're really lost, come here and you can immediately find out where you are. And while you're there, we're going to pique your interest with all these other interesting stories about what's around you to try and open up that uh, your exploration. So just into institutions, the nature of institutions is the second part of that quote that I gave you at the beginning. And we've experienced this because our work kind of touches a lot of different organizations. We're not always working for one developer, we're working for a city, and we have transport organizations, we've got developers, we've got landowners, and we've got different types of governmental organizations. One thing about institutions is they're built to survive. You know, They're around, like them or not, the way in which they are, imperfect or not, they are the best design that has lasted this long. So it's best to work with them. And an example of how organized institutions often find it difficult to coordinate. When we studied London, in central London, just in the congestion charge zone, we found 32 different information systems for guiding pedestrians. Um, is this a problem? We found all sorts of different units of measurements: minutes, quarter M's, meters, or yards. And we feel all of this is creating uncertainty. It's not a system that I recognize, that I can feel, that I don't have to think about. In other words, thinking fast, thinking slow. I have to work it out every time. And that means that 2.7% of all of this information in the city was actually being used. And also, it's about leadership. Big institutions change their leaders. They're not really built around their leaders, whereas a lot of private businesses are built around their leaders, but they're still only lasting 10, 20 years. Of all the big tech businesses, I think it's only Zuckerberg who's still there. Um, and but it's also about grand strategy. So good things can happen. This is Bob Kiley and Ken Livingstone on the tube, and there was a brilliant structure created by Ken to create Transport for London, which, with all the cities that we work with around the world, is looked at as a beacon. And he put together London buses, London Underground, the street system, the ferry service, and he basically said, well, you're now all the strategic transport authority for London, and your job is to connect all these parts and get them to work together. And that initiated a massive increase in bus travel. It's now twice what's carried by the tubes, which was precipitated by a connection as railheads coming from tube stations. So transport networks are about being connected. So to create an organisation that connects them, it really is the right idea. So in summary, in terms of in our experience, you need one of these three things to do something great in a city. You need some kind of unreasonable deadline. We've worked with three cities now that had Olympics on the way. You need some kind of maverick leadership. I'm sure you're all aware of the story of Jamie Lerner and how he helped transform Curitiba, image bottom left. Funding couldn't be raised to put in a subway system, so he said, well, why don't we just do it on the surface and make them feel like subways? And then you need to have an idea that unites, something that fits between organizations and hits all of their objectives, and you can put some kind of structure around them that connects them. And that's really what Legible London was. So moving on to the last part, really, talking about technology, and E.O. Wilson called it godlike technology, and it really is. I was watching the Terror recently, the story of the Endeavour and the Terror um, venturing around the Northwest Passage and getting stuck there for 2 years, eventually all dying. Um, and that was just over 200 years ago, maybe. I think the sextant was invented just 1757, something like this. Um, but nowadays, I could take my mobile phone and I could load up an app and I could navigate my way across the Northwest Passage. Um, and it is really quite incredible what technology is allowing us to do that we take really for granted. My question isn't that. It's really one of I wanted to play a video for you, but it's not been possible to get it loaded. It would take too long. And it's a video of CNN Business talking about Segway and its claim to solve the problem of the last mile. Now we kind of got a good idea why the Segway didn't really take off. People fell off it, and you look a bit of an idiot on it. But I think one of the main problems is it was trying to solve a problem that actually is already solved. The last mile isn't a problem in terms of walking. The last mile is a problem in terms of transit systems delivering people a mile away from where they want to be. And the challenge is one of an informational challenge. The last mile is an information problem. Um, And I think that is the solution that's missing. And this comes out in places like the Bay Area in California, where 5% of travel is on transit systems. And this is, in the middle of the tech industry. It is one of the most disconnected transport systems and one of the most congested road systems that you have anywhere in the Western world. And the tech industry is, rightly interested in automated vehicles. But again, let's ask the question, in terms of being transformative, what problem is it going to solve? And I think the real issue there is that it's all the studies that we've read, when it's not really going to solve the problem of congestion. Electric vehicles maybe solve some problems of air quality and energy use, but not automated cars. Secondary point on automated cars is that they're proving to be much more difficult to actually create than they expected. It's going to take a lot longer to appear. I don't think it's going to be around anytime soon. How do we solve the problem without this kind of a solution? I love this woman. She was an admiral in the U.S. Navy, Grace Hopper. Um, she was one of the people who they had a Hornet that got caught in one of these old magnetic memory devices, and hence that's where the word computer bug comes from. But she said, "I'm afraid we will keep buying beautiful pieces of hardware and convoluted software, and totally neglect the underlying thing, the flow of information. It will make a tremendous difference on how we design the systems of the future. Everything is a system." And this really resonates with what we see, because we're always trying to design a system that's built of information. And that means building an information architecture, building a naming structure, an addressing system. So whenever we're working on a new building or a development, we find a legacy naming structure that really isn't going to work to create those memory palaces that we want to create, because we want buildings, we want campuses, we want cities that are really easy to learn, that are really easy to remember, and that means we will want to keep going there and using it. And I'm sure you recognize Edward Snowden. His book is fascinating. He talks about systems from a technology point of view. He talks about the intelligence apparatus and these multiple divided up, compartmentalized knowledge gathering systems. And his job was a system architect, and he pieced them all together. In terms of in the IT industry, a systems architect is a well-known role. He was given the job, what, age 20 something, as a system architect, which meant he could see everything. And that was the reason why he became a whistleblower. What I think this tells me is that we really miss the right people in the role of the system architect for the city or the system architect for the campus. How are you organizing all of these systems so that the end user is getting the right information at the right time? I'm going to skip some of these. So, cities that connect with people, I think, in summary, require these three things in the future. How do we apply science? How do we apply this knowledge of neuroscience, of how people work and how they experience places? How do we design them better so that they work better for people? Because it's very hard to get people to change. Um, how do you create inter-organizational initiatives, things that pull different parties together so that they connect? And maybe you could add there, where are the mavericks that are going to push the boundaries to give us the examples that allow us to kind of like systemize things in the future? And how do we embrace the tech industry when they've got mature motivations? And that means it's not just profit, but it's people and it's the planet. And back to, how does this work for my examples of legible solutions? Well, in New York, this just needs to be much more obvious. It needs to say subway in really big letters and lit up. The sign at the bottom the design of these are all fine. The issue here is it needs an organizing system. It needs a way of saying, if you're going to put a sign up, you've got to look at everything else that's there, and there needs to be some architect to say whether this actually is approved. And then in Washington, yes, let's have mobile phones that don't ever run out of battery, but you also need a physical system that works with the digital system. I don't think you're ever going to get away from street signs guiding people driving cars rather than just using sat nav. We're always going to need a time where we're going to need both. So we get involved with projects around the world. If you find this interesting, if you think our insights are thoughtful, then we'd love to help you and help us, give us more challenges to tackle. And back to Star Wars, I was fascinated to see in the last Star Wars film they had something called the Wayfinder. I really hope this isn't what mobile phone GPS devices look like in the future. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Tim. Fascinating presentation about some very difficult issues in how we live our lives, particularly those of us who live in cities. One of the things that strikes me is that when you were talking about how what you get from the eye is actually quite a small part of what you understand because the brain is filling in the gaps. But I wonder if other senses might help us navigate. I'm thinking of sound and I'm thinking of smell in particular. And I think we're beginning to understand better how those sorts of or the sensations we get from those senses can help us with navigation and with understanding where we are.
Yes, that's correct. But the visual sense is very much the dominant one there. Um, what we get from our visual sense, our sense of when we walk into an enormous space or seeing where the exits are, is the visual is much stronger than those other senses. They can only ever really be supporting. Obviously, that's different when you don't have a strong visual ability, and that is incredibly limiting in certain environments. And the way in which technology can help people with visual challenges, I think is going to be a fantastic development in the future.
Yeah, so I think that's clearly technology might help with that. Technology might begin to help us, as it were, transform the sensations we get from sound into something we can read as space. Some people can do that naturally, but it's a very small minority.
We're working with an indoor positioning system at the moment that's got an accuracy down to about 3 meters, including height. Technically, it's a bit like uh, automated vehicles. It technically is very, very hard to do, but I think it can get more accurate than that. And when that does get that accurate, you've got some really supporting systems that could give feedback that's in an audio way, and guide people around who can't see. And technology is the way to tackle that because everybody has different challenges. They've got different abilities, and technology can adapt to your ability rather than trying to get an environment to adapt for everybody, which is not really possible.
Another comment you made, which I think is very interesting, is the legacy naming that we suffer from. That when you're trying to conceive new ways of laying out spaces, campus or buildings, we were stuck with, words and concepts that probably come from the Renaissance, maybe a little bit later, but they're very limited. And I wonder if you've made progress in this in terms of how we can use the language to describe these spaces.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And when I was talking about information architecture and system design, one thing we're really talking about is naming structure. Everywhere where we work, we find that the names that are there and that are being used or are planned for are not necessarily fit for purpose. They're sometimes over confused, there's sometimes too many, there's sometimes missing, there's sometimes development names that have become names that we're trying to use in our normal lexicon. And sometimes it's difficult to change a name because history has embedded it in our brains. It's become part of our play cells. So, if we went back and we've got Piccadilly Circus in London and we went back and decided to change the name of that to Samsung Circus, how many people would really call it that? It would be Piccadilly Circus for nearly all of us, for a long, many years. So names are much, and I've got my own personal view about naming rights is kind of like, if the thing's going to change over its lifetime, then fine, name it. But if it's going to last 100, 200 years, then don't name it after something that's going to change. You're heading for danger there. But naming is a core structure. When we developed the walking system for London, for example, we realized that a lot of people navigate by village names: Soho, Mayfair, Fitzrovia, and Chinatown, Leicester Square, Piccadilly Circus. What we then found out is that nobody was really in charge of those names. Estate agents came along and said, "Let's create NoHo. Let's create Midtown," said a business improvement district, which they've not caught on. They're not really being used. And that naming structure, we realized, is a wonderful structure for a city of London. It's different in Tokyo, it's different in New York. But that naming structure is a wonderful way, think back to those grid structures, to understand, well, Soho's just the other side of Mayfair, and you're over here. You need to go through Mayfair to Soho. And and then when you get to Soho, you can find the street and the bar that you're looking for, etc. So naming, a lot of our work is actually sorting out the architecture of naming initially.
And those names then relate to the bubbles that we might understand naturally. So we might have a sense of what Soho is because we might have lived there or worked there or for other reasons know it well. Similarly with Mayfair. So there is a relationship between the naming, the architecture of naming, as it were, there, and the architecture of how we perceive spaces and places, which I think is quite significant. But also, when we look into some of those, as it were, smaller communities, village areas of London, I think a lot of people don't think of them in the way an architect or an urbanist might do, which is as streets and squares and public spaces. They think of them by the destinations they have, as you were mentioning just now, the bar, the tube station, so they identify certain points, whereas someone who is trained to think in a more spatial way, such as an architect or an urbanist, might begin to think about the way those points connect.
Yeah, no, well, I think in that example you can have both, Jeremy, because what you're talking about there really was describing how people create play cells of a bar or a tube station or the M&S on the corner is a play cell. So it becomes a memory point. It's sort of like, where should we meet? Well, let's meet. I mean, the way in which we do it is we put all of these names into conversation. If it feels right in conversation, if it feels like something that you would say, then it's probably going to work. It's so if you say let's meet at the M&S, M&S is such an enormous, well-known store in the UK that you can use it as a landmark. Now, if I once went looking for a building in Seoul in Korea, and the numbers in Seoul it's changing now, but the numbers were based on when the building was built. So 77 is next to 33, next to 48. It's crazy, I know. But I said, well, where are you? And they said it was on a long, big, straight road in Gangnam. And they said, right, well, we're the building opposite the Starbucks. So I was in the taxi and we were driving along, and I said, okay, get me to the Starbucks. And the taxi driver said, which one do you want? There's three. So, landmarks have got to be unique. Then they can be useful. And what you're talking about in the second example there of an urban designer is, how do you create a name for an area? Well, we do have names for areas. We do name them based on a square or based on a landmark, or it can have its own its own Hackney Wick as opposed to Hackney Central. It can be maybe it's the tube station is often a way in which in London things get named, or the tube station's been named after the location. But if you think of a new city or a new place, how can you design it so it's got that sophistication to grow into? Um, and because you're just looking at blank spaces, if you can create this a really a wealthy area of names ready to adopt these place cells and give them meaning, then you're going to have a much more legible place pretty quickly.
I think that's interesting, and this is an example really of the truth of what you're saying. I think a lot of people, myself included, find it quite confusing that Clapham Junction Station is not really in Clapham, it's in Battersea. And that sets up all sorts of confusion about how you might think of it. But I also wonder about the way names might evolve. Now, I happen to have been doing, over the last year or so, research on various development sites in London. And it's quite interesting to find out how the place names evolved. So you take someone like Gospel Oak. I mean, that is because it was sufficiently far from central London for people to preach who were not necessarily licensed Church of England preachers. So they, under the tree, so it became Gospel Oak. Now, I don't think anyone goes there for religious reasons anymore, but the name has stuck. And I think that this has a parallel with what you were saying about institutions. Institutions tend to evolve structures, and they do evolve. They can change over time, sometimes very slowly. But they are not something in which any individual is in control of. As you say, when you change a place name, the example you gave, Piccadilly Circus, Samson Circus, no one would use it because it's so embedded as Piccadilly Circus. And I think that the names we have are carry a depth of history which can sometimes be very helpful in identifying what they are and why they are, even if we don't necessarily know the circumstances of their origin.
History is brilliant for place names, its character, its reason. What we do though is we come up with an index of how fit is the name. So if it's too similar to another name, you need to try and create some difference. If it's difficult to say, if it's difficult to say in language, it will get shortened. So if you look at Washington, DC on the subway, all the subway stations have got 3 names. Nobody in DC calls them by their triple-barreled name. The first name is what they get called. So why bother having 3 names? So there are certain guidelines, and then it's freedom, and it's freedom to invent within those guidelines.
Yes, and of course that goes then for the spaces as well, that once we start to understand how we might navigate, we can begin to think about what spaces might be navigable. And I think someone like John O'Keefe, the legacy that he initiated is absolutely remarkable. I mean, one of the points I seem to remember about his work is that he found that he discovered that London cabbies, who obviously have to remember, much of the street plan of London in their head, tend to have very large hippocampuses in their brains, because that is the part of their brain that they depend on for their careers. And what I don't remember whether he shared this or not, is whether the sort of people who become cabbies have a natural tendency, as it were, to grow their hippocampuses, or whether they grow them as a result of becoming cabbies. And I think that clearly some people have a capacity to work out how spaces work and how they interact and to navigate, and other people don't. So I think that has set up all sorts of very interesting points for us to think about. So Tim, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for your time.